All right, so now we're on the final lecture for the 20s and 30s boom and bust period. We're in the last portion of the New Deal, and after we get through with this, you're basically going to jump into your test, followed by going into your World War II section about U.S. history. But first things first, this is mostly about the Supreme Court and major acts of Congress that FDR put through later on in the New Deal. But first, in 1935, the court struck down the NERA and also the AAA, which is the Labor Relations Act as well as the Agricultural Act. Both got struck down as being overly intrusive. The court said no, got to redo it. So now we have the National Labor Relations Act, and it kind of updated and replaced NERA, which got overturned by the Supreme Court. This is still in place today. It gave recognition to unions, like formally, and gave them the right to collectively bargain. A collective bargain is when you get all the members of the union to come together and bargain, or basically try to organize for better working conditions, better pay, better benefits. Then we got the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And to give you some time frame going on, this is when Hitler has risen to power in Germany. That's all taking place during this time period. This act established a minimum wage. Also established a minimum age for child laborers. So 25 cents an hour, along with a maximum work week of 44. Now, they're still in place, these rules. They still exist for people 16 and over, and 18 for hazardous occupations. All these various little things still exist today. So like an 18-year-old today can engage in hazardous labor, whether it's construction or things that are inherently dangerous, they can do that. If you're 16, you can't. If you're 17, you can't. But you hit 18, you can do those things. It limits your wages. It gives you a minimum wage. And nowadays, there's other like state-level implications, like you only work for a certain time. You can't work past midnight. Those kind of different variations. Like you see a lot of at restaurants, you'll see 18-year-olds. They can move the alcohol around. Like they can take like cases of beer, but they can't serve alcohol because they're not bartenders. You have to be 21. Well, if you're bussing tables and you're 15 or 16, if you're 16, you can't do that. You can't even pick up the alcohol because that's illegal. So all these various things are set up at the state level and the national level. All right, the Social Security Administration. This is probably the biggest thing that came out of the New Deal. If you were to pick one thing that comes out of the New Deal and you just blurt out Social Security, because it's still in existence today, and the whole idea behind it was put forth by this lady named Frances Perkins to aid the elderly, disabled, and dependent children of people who had died, basically. So you're talking about people who can't fend for themselves economically. It literally is a way, what you do is you pay money now, and the old people now benefit from it. So right now I'm paying Social Security taxes for people who are turning 65 currently. Now when I'm turning 65, there will be a bunch of 20, 30, 40, 50-year-olds all paying into Social Security for my benefits. And that's basically how it works. You're paying for you're paying for the current generation of old people, and then you're paid for by future generations of young people. That's how it works. And it's taken out of your payroll taxes. And here's FDR actually signing the Social Security Act into law in 1935. And there's Frances Perkins right there. She was the first female member of the cabinet. She was Secretary of Labor, which was a big, big deal. And she pushed hard to get the Social Security Act passed. Now, people nowadays, there's a lot of debate over what Social Security is. Some people actually call it a Ponzi scheme based on how it works. And whether or not it'll be sustainable. That's one of the fears. Social Security reform is always a big election issue. The idea of reforming Social Security. Now, I will say this. Early on in Social Security, it was never meant to be your retirement. It was meant to supplement your retirement. So there were people out there who, for whatever reason, because they didn't know much about it, were turning 65 back in the 50s, thinking, oh, man, I can just spend all money and I'll have retirement from the government. And then they find out, oh, the government's not paying me too much. And that kind of habit went on for decades. Like you would have people in the 1970s thinking they were going to like just retire on their Social Security, and that just wasn't true. It never was meant to allow you to just not have any savings and just burn through your money and then have Social Security to help you get through. It was meant to supplement your retirement. It was meant, or at best, it was meant to keep you off the breadlines, keep you from being homeless at an old age. All right, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This is the largest public works projects. They did they spent so much money and built so much stuff. And this is all about that Keynesian economic model where you just pump money out there, you pay people that money for doing the work, they then spend the money, which then pumps the economy up and gets people spending money and gets people feeling confident again, because economics is based on consumer confidence to a large degree. All right, the best example in the Rocky Mountain area of a public works project is City Lake. So you got City Lake. It was put forth by FDR's administration in 1937, and it's gone over a few facelifts recently, but the biggest one was in 1993, and it's a very pretty lake to this day. It's in Rocky Mount. So these public works projects weren't just in the cities. They weren't just out in the Midwest. They were everywhere. They were trying to literally just spend money wherever they could in an effort to pay people a wage that they would then use to spend on other consumer goods and build confidence and boost up the economy. Here's the airfield in Rocky Mount, which was also a public works project. All right, the PWA, the Public Works Administration. It was set up to provide jobs to build roads, schools, and other public works and put money into the economy and provided jobs as part of the NRA and not the National Rifle Association. It's the other one we talked about earlier. Here are just some major examples. And so the WPA and the Public Works Administration, they kind of worked hand in hand. They got things done, same kind of work, just different things. So like you're talking about with the WPA, they employ things like artists, major construction. These guys in the Public Works Project, they were just trying to build infrastructure, things like roads, things like ferry access. You might an airport, various things that basically make it so you can get to point A to point B more efficiently. And you can actually or building usable buildings for the public use, like they would build fire stations, that kind of stuff. Anything to up the ability and the value of land, like linking the Florida Keys up there. You see it on the sheet right here. There's a highway linking the Florida Keys to the mainland of the U.S. So they built a big old bridge basically to link up the Florida Keys, the island chain at the south end of Florida, to the mainland. That would be a big deal because it allowed access for things like tourism. Again, anything that could boost the economy, they spent the money on it and they paid people to do the labor. That way it would boost the economy. And here's a PWA power plant project over in Oregon. They were building a power plant. Again, power infrastructure is being utilized here. All right, now, I've made it all sound like roses and kisses and unicorns, but there were critics of what Roosevelt was doing. One of the big ones was a guy named Charles, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Colin. He was nicknamed the Radio Priest. He was pro-fascist, basically saying he was not pro-Hitler, but pro-fascist ideology. He liked Mussolini, what he was doing, and he was very anti-Semitic. So you're talking about someone who's anti-Jewish and pro-fascist. Nowadays, obviously, we don't look at this guy very positively, and back then, he was an opponent to FDR. Originally, he liked FDR, then kind of turned on him because he didn't, and one of the big reasons was he did not do enough, according to Colin, enough for the little guy. Huey Long, same deal. He was a senator from Louisiana, and he tried to basically compete with FDR with the phrase share the wealth. That was his slogan. He wanted to tax the rich and share it with the poor. He was assassinated in 1935, but the big thing is both him and Coughlin did not like FDR's New Deal because it didn't help out the average person. And their argument with that was basically saying, well, these public works projects, all this money spending, yeah, you're paying the little guy a pittance a little bit, and they're spending their little bit to boost the economy. But there's also contractors, businesses. They're the ones that are actually doing the work and then paying out that wage. You're helping out fat cats who are building buildings with U.S. government contracts. You're not actually helping out the little guys working for them. All right, some other big notes about the New Deal in general. After the New Deal, government's involvement in everyday life went way up. So remember that whole laissez-faire concept? Laissez-faire was everything. You kept your hands off of business. You kept your hands out of the people's affairs. You kept your hands out of the states. States pretty much ran their own governments how they wanted to. After the New Deal, the economy and the government and states and people and business activity are much more heavily regulated. A lot more people were put to work, but it also ended up with a lot more regulation. So more jobs were made, but there was no longer this laissez-faire kind of look at things. And it's only become more progressively regulatory. There's been less deregulation over time. More notes about the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court, first slide of this presentation, shut down and overturned a bunch of FDR's initiative, including NERA and the AAA. Well, FDR's solution to this, because his party had control of the Senate and the House, as well as him being a president, he wanted to basically appoint a bunch of new Supreme Court justices, because that's part of the Constitution. Article 3 says there's a Supreme Court, And basically, the number of court justices is decided by the Congress. So Congress can pass a law saying we're adding members of the court. The president then appoints them, and they'll vote his way. So what he was going to do was basically do what's called court reform. In this case, FDR's idea was to put 6 new seats on the Supreme Court, which would then be basically just be copies of FDR's opinion. And overall, the idea was, instead of it being decisions against FDR, they'd all vote for his case, which would basically make him the winner. And there was a fear that he would do what's called packing the court, basically nearly doubling the size of the court just so he'd win. At the very last second, there was one major case coming up with one of FDR's key pieces of legislation. One court justice switched his decision. He'd always been against FDR over and over and over again, against the New Deal, and then suddenly he switched. And they call this the switch in time that saved 9, because there's 9 court justices. And basically the conventional history on it is that the reason why that guy switched was so that FDR would not put forth his court reform and pack the court. That is what the fear was. And here's the Alphabet Agency cartoon. There's FDR standing, oddly enough, even though he could not. And all the little kids, these are all his children. His babies are these alphabet agencies. Now, this is FDR throwing out all the old, remember here, the whole rugged individualism. This was Hoover's idea, being separate, teapot, dome scandal, all that fun stuff being thrown out. A chicken in every pot, all that whole famous for GOP Republican policies. He's throwing them all out, and that's how he's going to change the world. So Herbert Hoover is being kicked out in his little carpet bag, all that fun stuff. All right, thanks for watching, guys.